Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next big chunk of the semester. For the next few weeks, we're going to be discussing plants and fungi, and we're going to start with chapter 14, discussing plant diversification. So, first things first, what are plants? Most of us probably are like, yeah, I know what a plant is, but we're going to talk about them in super detail, more than you ever thought you would ever want to know about plants, okay? So plants are eukaryotic and multicellular. They were actually the first multicellular organisms to colonize dry land. So they're kind of the pioneers that allowed for the diversity we see on land today. Most plants are terrestrial, but some can be aquatic. They have a wide range of habitats. So, if you've ever been to the Arctic, you'll see plants there. If you've ever been to the tropics, you'll definitely see lots of plants there. And then there's also plants, if you've ever been on the top of a mountain, there are plants there. And, plants like this in the deserts and things like that in low terrain. So plants have a wide range of where they're located. You can find plants almost anywhere. And plants can vary in size. So we have some, very small plants like mosses that lay towards the ground, but we also have giant plants, right? Like giant redwoods and things like that, and sequoias. So there's a lot of variety we see in plants. Plants undergo a process called alternation of generation, which we'll talk about in a lot more detail throughout the rest of this presentation. But essentially, they have two life stages, a haploid and a diploid stage in their life cycle, and their embryos develop within the female plant, and they don't leave they don't leave the female organ of the plant. Plants are their main kind of claim to fame is their ability to undergo photosynthesis. And this is the construction or the building of carbohydrates from CO2, water, and sunlight. Okay. And they can do this through the use of chlorophyll, but not all of them use chlorophyll. Some of them can use other pigments, but the ability to undergo photosynthesis using chlorophyll is a homologous character. So this was a characteristic that is derived from a shared common ancestor of all plants on Earth. And some plants do not undergo photosynthesis readily. They're actually parasitic. So I wouldn't necessarily say all of them have to have chlorophyll, but because some of them are parasitic, and you can see those when we look at some of those vines that are on trees. They don't have any type of chlorophyll to undergo photosynthesis. They're just sucking the carbohydrates straight out of the trees or bushes that they have wrapped themselves around. There are two major components of a plant. We have our roots, which are our underground segments of the plant. And then we have our shoots, which are our above ground elements of the plant, which includes the stems and the leaves. The roots are responsible for obtaining nutrients from the soil and also anchoring the plant in place. And the leaves are responsible for undergoing photosynthesis, and the stem is responsible for providing structure and support for the plant. And then their leaves are their cell walls, all their cell walls, and the leaves, the roots, and the shoots have cellulose in them, so they're made mostly of cellulose. Plants are immobile, right? If you ever see a plant get up and run, they'd be terrifying, right? So we all know that plants can't move. However, they are still able to respond to stimuli and defend themselves. And because they're unable to move, they have to figure out interesting, innovative ways in order to defend themselves and respond to their environment. So let's talk about the history of plants. So plants have come a long way. As I mentioned, they've been here for a long time, and they were the first multicellular organisms to colonize land. So where did plants start? Plants started with a plant-like protist ancestor, right? So this ancestor lived in the water. It's what we refer to as green algae, and it basically these green algae protists, plant-like protists, were hanging out in the oceans and in the water, and then eventually through natural selection and evolution, we found that they started to colonize land and turn into plants like we know them today. So in order for a plant to go from a aquatic protist to being a eukaryotic plant like we know today, they had to adjust to life on land. Well, life on land came with many, many challenges. One, they had to resist desiccation, right? If you are a protist and you're living in the water, you don't have to worry about drying out. You live in water. But if you're now going to be living on land, you have to be able to protect yourself from drying out. And so plants were developed two characteristics that allowed them to live on land. One, a vascular system, which allowed them to obtain nutrients and water from the soil to prevent drying out, but also a cuticle that surrounds their stems and leaves. And this cuticle prevents water from readily evaporating from the tissues. They also had to be able to combat gravity. When you're in water, you just float. But once you're on land, now you have to battle with gravity pulling you down. And to do this, there were a couple of things that happened. First, we started with plants that grew low to the ground, so they didn't have to really fight gravity. The lower you are to the ground, the less gravity is pulling on you. But then as plants evolved, they evolved vascularization, which allowed for them to grow taller and fight gravity a little bit more and have more structure. And then they had to be able to find a way to reproduce and proliferate. When you're a single-celled protist that's in the water, you can interact with other protists, you can swim around and things like that. But as I mentioned, plants are immobile. So now they had to find a way of reproducing and spreading their population to colonize the land. And there are a couple of mechanisms that plants have been able to do this through the use of seeds and spores, so for reproduction and for proliferation, and then the use of flowers and fruits as a way to help spread their genetic information around and to colonize different areas. Plants appeared approximately 472 million years ago, which is a long, long, long time, right? And what they looked like back then is a little bit different from what we expect today. They were hypothesized to have green stems and have no roots, no leaves, and no flowers. So they're very, very rudimentary plants, kind of going from the protist lifestyle to an actual plant. One phyla of life of plants that we can look at to maybe get an idea of what early plants looked like are our bryophytes. And these include our mosses, our hornworts, and our liverworts. And it's hypothesized that early plant ancestors had a lot of similarities to common day bryophytes. They're non-vascular, so they don't have any sort of tubing. We'll talk more about what vascularization is, but they have no tubing to transport water and nutrients throughout their tissues. Instead, they obtain nutrients through diffusion from the water and the soil in moist areas. And they have small micro projections that help to absorb water and nutrients from soil. Not roots, but there's just these small projections that are helping to absorb nutrients, but not necessarily roots at this point. Mosses, liverworts, and hornworts all require moisture. So if you've ever been out in the woods or near a lake and things like that, you'll see these are very, very common. And once those areas dry out, or if you're in a very dry area, you won't really see these organisms as frequently because they require moisture to survive and reproduce. They undergo what we already talked about was alternation of generation, and they have their gametophyte stage of the life cycle is dominant. And in the next slide, we'll talk about what all that kind of stuff means. And as I mentioned, they require water to reproduce. Bryophytes are economically and environmentally impactful, and for many reasons. So they help to anchor loose soils together and hold them in place. And this is vital for areas that the soil grains may be not so compact, and the soil may move around a lot and is unstable. So these bryophytes coat these areas and these surfaces and help to hold the land in place. Additionally, they're economically viable because many of these places in the world have what we call peat moss. And peat moss, if you've ever done any type of landscaping or gardening, you may be familiar with peat moss because we commonly use it to add nutrients to the soil. But if you're not, essentially, there's these areas where bryophytes have built up over time. And in addition to uses in agriculture and in gardening, people also have peat mosses that help to protect regions near land from various natural disasters. So these little guys, we might not think of them so much, but they do have a wide impact on our lives as we know them. Alteration of generation, as I mentioned, is when an organism has both a haploid and a diploid stage in its life cycle. The haploid stage is referred to as the gametophyte stage, and it undergoes sexual reproduction. So it has male and female gametes. And then the diploid stage is referred to as the sporophyte stage, and it undergoes asexual reproduction. We're going to look at the alteration of generation in more detail for mosses. We're going to start here, and then we'll also look at it in more complex plants. But we're going to start with mosses. So just as a reminder, in the last slide I mentioned that the gametophyte stage of the mosses and the bryophytes is dominant. And so what does that mean? That means the sexual stage, the haploid stage of mosses is most commonly what we see, is the most pervasive part. So when we go out in the woods and you see this kind of like fuzzy, nice kind of looking material that's growing on rocks and on trees and on the ground, that's actually the haploid stage. So what we normally think of as mosses is haploid. The diploid element, the sporophyte, is less recognizable to us, and it actually looks like this. These kind of projections that shoot out from the mossy, spongy area into the air. That is the diploid stage. So going back, so the haploid stage, the spongy material we're familiar with, within this material there are actually male and female structures. So if you're looking at the moss up close, your male structure looks like this, and then your female structure looks like this. And they're spread out throughout the moss. And when it rains or when water from a lake or body of water goes over the moss, it will carry the sperm from the male structures to the egg in the female structures to allow for fertilization. After fertilization, we end up with a diploid zygote. So the sperm and egg are N, so their ploidy is 1, and the zygote is 2N. Okay, so they have 2 copies, they're diploid. The zygote will then undergo mitosis to grow and become an embryo, and it will remain within the female structure, so it doesn't leave. It basically will just divide and grow within the female reproductive organ on the moss. And as it grows, it'll start to make these projections like you see here that shoot out, that grow out of the female structure, and they'll form a capsule on the very top of the structure, which is, these are the capsules, right? This is all diploid. So these structures are diploid. The cells contained within are diploid. Those diploid cells that are within it will, within these capsules, will undergo meiosis to form haploid spores. So now that capsule contains a whole bunch of spores that are all N, so they're all haploid. Then once ready, the capsules will release the spores into the environment, and they will anchor somewhere in some soil. And as long as it's moist and the environment is favorable, those spores will germinate into more haploid moss, which looks like this fuzzy green moss. So after we got our bryophytes, they're very, very simple. They can only really grow close to the ground. They have to be moist. A huge advancement in the anatomy of plants occurred: vascularization. So we now ended up with seedless plants. So they have no seeds. They're still reproducing using spores, but they have vascular tissue. And vascular tissue basically are these tubes that run from the roots to the shoots of the plant, and they're able to carry nutrients and water throughout all of the tissues. So this is what normally when you look at a plant, we've all kind of drawn our typical leaf, right? And when you're in school, you generally probably draw a leaf something like that, and you draw like this, right? All these little lines that you would be drawing would be representing the vascular tissue. And this method of using it's almost like a circulatory system for plants is actually faster and more efficient than using diffusion. So when you're using diffusion, it's slow and it also limits your size. The bigger you are, the less efficient diffusion is, and diffusion is not able to really effectively get nutrients to cells and structures that are contained within a dense mass. But if you have a vascular system, you're now able to get nutrients and water spread evenly throughout all of the tissues and effectively. So vascularization allowed for plants to go from I have to be at the water, have to be moist almost all the time, to being able to colonize areas that are a lot more dry, where there's moisture in the soil, but maybe not necessarily getting moisture on the leaves and stems, because they can pull that moisture out of the soil and add it to and apply it to those tissues that are in drier regions of the plant. They're using, like I said, the roots for nutrients, but the roots also allowed for support. So in bryophytes, they had no roots. They just had these small projections, which means they had to grow low. They couldn't fight gravity. They had to grow low to the surface. But once plants developed roots, the roots actually help to anchor the plant in place. So now if it wants to grow taller, against gravity, that plant can without falling over or being unstable. So the development of vascular tissue and roots in these plants allow for the taller, bigger plants that can grow in drier areas. These are some characteristics or some common vascular seedless plants that you might be familiar with are ferns and horsetails. Most of you guys probably have seen a fern at some point. If you need to see a horsetail, definitely Google it. I had no idea what a horsetail was until recently. But essentially, you've seen a fern. You've seen where the leaves, if you flip on the underside, a lot of times they'll have these little spots, and those are the spores. So they also undergo alternation of generation, but a little bit different. In this case, they are sporophyte dominant. So the plant that we associate with as a fern is actually the diploid sporophyte part of the life cycle. The haploid part of the life cycle, the gametophyte, is actually almost unrecognizable to us as a fern, but it is still a fern. So we'll talk about that like now. So when you have a fern, you have your diploid fern, which you are familiar with if you've ever had a fern in your house, or you've been in the woods, or been to someone's house. And on the underside of the leaves commonly, but they can be located elsewhere, you'll have these spores, these spore packets. And those will get released, and these are haploid spores. So the fern itself is 2N, but the spores are N, okay? The spores get released into the environment, and they go to some other area where there's nice nutritious soil, and they will develop this haploid structure, which looks like a heart, and that is actually the gametophyte fern. So I actually include a video at the end of this presentation, and the guy is a little interesting, but he does describe ferns really well, and he does actually show you some examples of the haploid, the gametophyte fern, and so you can kind of see what they look like. They're very, very small, and they kind of look like these heart-shaped leaves. This haploid version, this gametophyte, will then produce sperm and egg, And when water is involved, it will move allow the sperm to swim to the egg, so via water. And once the sperm fertilize the egg, we end up with our zygote, which will develop into a mature embryo within the female structures, just like we saw in mosses. And that as that diploid zygote, so our 2N zygote, grows and develops, it'll eventually develop into a full-grown fern as we know it. So we have our diploid fern that we know of as a fern when we see a fern, produces spores. Those spores are haploid spores, which will then go to soil and mature and form the gametophyte stage. So it's the haploid, the end stage, which looks like this heart structure. And that gametophyte fern will produce sperm and egg. The sperm swim to the egg using water to undergo fertilization, and that zygote and embryo that results from fertilization becomes another fern as we know it. I know this process can be a little bit confusing, so going through it a couple times, you'll start to get the idea of what's happening here. The next major step in plant evolution that allowed for them to be as pervasive as we know them today is the development of a seed. And so what is a seed? Most of us have seen seeds, most of us have eaten seeds, and we think we know seeds, but what is it? What are they? So a seed is composed of three major parts. The first being an embryo, and this is a multicellular diploid embryo. And then we also have our endosperm. And our endosperm is all of this section here, all of this kind of fluff, if you will, that makes up a seed. It's usually the fleshy parts that we like to eat. And this is actually the nutritive pack for the embryo. So it is the nutrients that the embryo will use when it's first developing before it can develop its roots and get nutrients from the soil. And the seed is protected by this some sort of coating on the outside, so to keep it protected from the elements or animals' digestive tracts and things like that. There are two major classes of plants that produce seeds, and there are Gymnosperms and our Angiosperms, and we'll talk about those in a lot more detail in the next couple of slides. They also undergo alternation of generation, and the sporophyte stage is dominant. So when you're looking at these plants and you can look at a tree and say, oh, apple tree, or you look at something and you're like, oh, that's a tulip, you're looking at the sporophyte or the diploid stage of their life cycle. And they have pollen and ovules in order to undergo sexual reproduction, and they undergo sexual reproduction via pollination. So the use of pollen grains and ovules for fertilization is called pollination. And some examples of vascular seed plants are pretty much everything that you would associate with as being a plant today. Pine trees, fir trees, redwoods, any trees, any flowering plants, orchids, tulips, sunflowers, mulberry bushes, blackberry bushes. All of these things are vascular seeded plants. So now I want to take some time to talk about some common stages in the reproductive cycles of angiosperms and genosperms. We're going to talk a lot more in detail about each category of plants' reproductive cycles as we go through, but there's just a couple of common details to keep in mind. The first being that both angiosperms and gymnosperms use pollen grains and ovules in reproduction. So the pollen grain is what many of you guys are pretty familiar with if you've ever lived in Georgia for any period of time in the spring when everything is covered in this like yellow dust. That's all the pollen, right? And these pollen grains are responsible for carrying the sperm and the sperm cells. And then they also use a ovule, and the ovule houses the egg. So, ovule. So both gymnosperms and angiosperms use pollen grains to house their sperm and transport sperm, and the ovule to house the egg. Both angiosperms and gymnosperms lack a free-living haploid stage of their life cycle. So what we talked about in bryophytes and our vascular non-seeded plants, they had a haploid stage of their life cycle that lived free and independent of the diploid stage. However, in our vascular seeded plants, the haploid stage remains encased within the diploid stage. So it doesn't live free as its own organism. And some common steps to keep in mind is between both angiosperms and gymnosperms is that one, the pollen grains are produced and carried to the female reproductive structures. And once the pollen grain is in close proximity to the ovule, it will create a pollen tube, allowing that will connect to from the pollen grain to the ovule and allow for the sperm to travel through the pollen tube to fertilize the egg. And then fertilization will occur and will result in a diploid zygote, and that zygote will undergo mitosis to become an embryo, and that embryo may take a couple of weeks, a couple of days, a couple of months to develop. But once it's fully developed, or as it's developing, they will begin to produce a seed. So you have your endosperm, your embryo, and your seed coat will all develop. And then the seed will continue to mature, and once ready, it will be released into the environment to form another diploid plant. So first of all, gymnosperms. We're going to talk about them first because they're older. Gymnosperms are older than angiosperms, and essentially they have cones. They're pretty ubiquitous. If you've been, like we talked about in the beginning, if you've been to the top of mountains, you've seen gymnosperms. If you've been to the beach, you've seen gymnosperms. These are a lot of times are like pine trees, are firs, things like that. Many of them have needle-like leaves. If you ever have seen a Christmas tree, then you know what a gymnosperm looks like. They have two types of wooded structures. They have their heartwood and their bark, and this provides rigidity to the plant to allow them to grow as tall as they are and to resist pressures from wind and things like that, because these trees, when you think of them and you see them, they're pretty massive, right? So they need this rigid wooded elements in their tissues to keep them from tipping over, or allow them to grow as tall to resist gravity. Some produce pitch or sap. Maple syrup comes from a gymnosperm. And like I mentioned, they are the common characteristics. They have cones. So there are two types of cones. There are, especially if you've been anywhere in the United States in temperate regions, this type of cone is one that you're probably most familiar with. Let's see, maybe choose a different color. Yeah, this one. This is actually a female cone, and those are the ones that we most associate with a cone. The male cone is actually this guy, and those are what produce the sperm. So the eggs are located within the female cone, and then the sperm are produced from the male cone. Most of the time, if you're looking at a cone on the ground, it's a female cone. The male cones are much smaller, and they can be found kind of more in the trees, on the branches. So how the alternation of generation occurs in gymnosperms is that the diploid let me see a different color. The diploid tree that we know of, so our 2N, has female and male structures associated with them. So they have the male cone and the female cone, like we just talked about, that have the sperm and the egg. So the sperm and the egg are haploid. The sperm is located within pollen grains, which are shown here, and the pollen is not the sperm. The pollen grain contains the haploid sperm. And then the eggs are contained within ovules that are at the base of the pine cone, of the pine cone kind of pricks. So try to draw this out for you guys. If you think of the each of these individual kind of teeth on the pine cone, looks something, I guess, like, very crude drawing, but this is the outside of the pine cone that we see, and then this is the base, and then it's attached to the kind of core of the cone. The embryo is located here. Oh, not the embryo, sorry, the egg. The egg is located at the base of the cone, and then it's encased in an ovule. And then the pollen grain, when it gets carried by wind, goes and gets into these little crevices and is able to get close to the ovule. Once it's close to the ovule, it will produce a pollen tube, which will go from the pollen grain into the ovule, and will allow the sperm to travel through the pollen tube, through the ovule to the egg, and fertilize the egg. Once the egg is fertilized, we end up with our diploid zygote, which will develop into a embryo and be cased in a seed. And once the seed is mature and the pine cone is ready, it will release this seed into the environment, where it will stick to a substrate, the soil, that is nutritive, and form a new pine tree or fir or whatever type of tree it is. Most of us are familiar with pollen grains. If you've been in Georgia for any period of time, when the whole place turns yellow, all of those are pollen grains. And essentially these trees release millions, billions of pollen grains into the wind, hoping that at least some of these grains will find a female cone and be able to fertilize the eggs. So all of those yellow pollen is the packets containing the sperm, hoping that they'll get a chance to fertilize an egg in a cone. Now we have our angiosperms, and our angiosperms are our flowering plants. And these are the ones that we all love. We love to smell them, we love to decorate with them, we love to eat things from them, and we get so inspired from them because of their beauty. Angiosperms are the most diverse category of plants on Earth. So Genosperms are older, but angiosperms are far more diverse, and they've been able to be very successful in spreading all over the world. They have flowers, which is their key characteristic, and the flower actually houses their reproductive structures. So there are a couple of parts to a flower that you should know. We have our stem, and then above our stem we have our sepal. And the sepal are these green modified leaves that you'll see at the base of the flower. And they're responsible for encasing and housing the bud before the flower is mature. So it protects the flower, the developing flower, from the elements. And then we have our petals, and our petals are our modified leaves. These are normally, they look like this kind of thing. They can be various colors and shapes and sizes. And this is what we normally associate with a flower, right? When you see a flower, it's usually petals that you associate with. And then within the flower, we have our two reproductive structures. We have our male structure, which is called the stamen. And the stamen consists of a filament, which is the stalk, the supporting stalk here, that holds up the anther. And the anther is where pollen grains are made. So pollen grains are made in the anther, and they just basically held up high by these filaments. And then we have our carpel, and our carpel is our female structure. And at the very top, it has a stigma. And the stigma is basically like a sticky pad that's at the very top of the style. And the style is this kind of base here. And the style is kind of like a long neck or tube that leads to the ovary. And within the ovary, we have our ovule and our egg. So keep all those structures in mind. The flowers, just like when we were looking at the gymnosperms, require wind to reproduce. They really rely on wind to carry their pollen grains to the stigma of various other flowers of the same species. But something really cool um, that angiosperms can use that gymnosperms generally don't are pollinators. So they can attract various different organisms to help them reproduce. And this image here is, I think, is really cool because they can use two different methods: bribery or trickery. So in trickery, the flower will sometimes mimic something that's attractive to whatever organism that they need to spread their pollen, to get them to come close and stick their pollen to them. So in this case, this orchid has a central region that looks like a female bee. And essentially, a male bee will see it, go over to that plant, and try to mate with this orchid because it thinks it's a female bee. And while it's moving around trying to copulate, the pollen from the orchid will stick to the bee's fur. And then the bee eventually will get upset because it's not going to work and fly off, and it'll get tricked by another by another orchid. And when it goes to try to copulate with that orchid, it will drop off the pollen from the first flower to the stigma of the other new flower. So that's kind of one way. They also can use bribery. So in bribery, a lot of plants will have sweet nectars or some type of sugary substance that will attract pollinators to it. And as that, let's say like a bee or an ant or something like that is drinking that nectar, it will deposit pollen grains onto that organism, and then when it flies somewhere else to get nectar, the pollen will be deposited on the stigma of another plant. So they can use wind, but they can also use pollinators. They can also use water as well as a method of reproduction. There's a lot of evidence that there's been coevolution between pollinators and their plants. Most plants aren't pollinated by every organism. They have a very strong relationship with a select few pollinators, and as the plant will start to evolve and change and develop different characteristics, the pollinator will also start to develop characteristics as well that allow them to be more effective at getting whatever resources it is from that plant. So some plants you'll find will have very long, thin like structures and have nectar at the back of it. So let's say we have a flower that my artistic skills here. Say we have a flower. Yikes. And it's shaped like this. And at the back of this has like a tube. And let's say there's nectar located at the base here. If there's a long tube and there's nectar at the back of the base, then there's only certain pollinators that can reach that nectar. And so let's say the base gets longer and longer, the pollinator, in order to get that nectar, you'll start to see them get longer and longer proboscises and things like that. And so this coevolution is so strong that sometimes just by looking at a plant, biologists can tell what kind of pollinators that plant has because of this coevolution. It's really quite interesting. There are a lot of similarities between reproduction in angiosperms and gymnosperms, but there's some major differences, and the biggest difference being the process of double fertilization that occurs in angiosperms. And so just as a reminder, in gymnosperms, we have pollen that's produced on a male cone that is transported to the female cone via wind, and then those pollen grains get in between the cracks on the female cone and are put in close proximity to the ovule, and then the pollen grain will make a pollen tube into the ovule to allow the sperm to travel from the pollen grain to the ovule to fertilize the egg, and then the seed will develop from that. And then in gymnosperms, the endosperm of the seed is also already being pre-made. In angiosperms, the process is very different. In angiosperms, they require two fertilization events for a seed to be produced. The first is fertilization of the egg to form the diploid zygote, and the second is fertilization of the endosperm to make a triploid endosperm. And also in angiosperms, the endosperm is not produced until it's fertilized. So in gymnosperms, they already are producing an endosperm, and if that egg is not fertilized, then the endosperm is just lost. But in angiosperms, you must have a fertilization event for the endosperm to start to form, and this is really good at conserving energy until it's actually needed on behalf of the plant. So going through some of the process of double fertilization, we start with pollen grains that are derived from the anther of one plant will travel via wind, water, or pollinators to the stigma of another plant, and it will become stuck to that sticky stigma. Once it's stuck, a pollen tube will begin to form, and it will release a single diploid cell. So this is a diploid cell that will give rise to our haploid sperm. And as the tube is continuing to extend down the style and getting closer and closer to the ovule, it will undergo meiosis to result in two haploid sperm. Okay. So while this process is occurring and the pollen tube is being extended, the cells within the ovule are also undergoing mitosis and meiosis to give you a couple different types of cells. We have some cells that lie on our periphery. We have these two nuclei in this larger cell in the center. This will later become our endosperm after fertilization. And then we have our three cells that lie on the periphery here, and one of those cells will become our egg. So then once the pollen tube has met the ovule, it will release its two haploid sperm into the ovule. The first will fertilize the egg to form a diploid zygote, and the second will fertilize the endosperm to produce a triploid endosperm, which is 3N. After this occurs, the embryo will continue to undergo mitosis and replicate, and the endosperm will also undergo mitosis, and it will start to develop a seed. And then once the seed is mature, it will be released into the environment, and if it falls into some nutritive soils, it will develop into a new mature diploid plant. Scientists have found that angiosperms have smaller gametes than gymnosperms, and this has allowed them to undergo faster seed production and allow them to also have shorter life cycles. So you can have an angiosperm that will go through its complete life cycle from birth to death, if you will, within a year, whereas you do not see this happen in gymnosperms. So something you might be asking yourself, since we talked about the general structure of a flower, is how do flowers prevent self-fertilization? So we know that inbreeding decreases biodiversity and is generally not favorable for organisms. And so we want outbreeding. We want to get genes from the same species, but different individuals of the same species, to allow for healthier and organisms and more diversity, more genetic diversity. So in order for plants to decrease or discourage self-fertilization, they can use a couple of methods. One is they might stagger when their anthers and their carpel will mature. So they might have anthers that mature first and release their pollen that will go on to stick to the stigmas of other flowers way before their carpels even mature. So that will prevent self-fertilization because the pollen grains from itself cannot stick to the stigma of its own flower. Additionally, the pollen is coated in lots of proteins, and so there's a molecular recognition pathway that has to occur in order for the carpel to accept the pollen grain. And some flowers, if the genetic information that is within the pollen, so like the proteins on the outside, is the same as the carpel, the stigma will not allow that pollen tube to start to form, because it recognizes this is my own pollen, and it will reject its own pollen grains in favor of pollen grains that come from another organism of the same species. Another really cool thing that angiosperms can do that gymnosperms do not is they produce fruits. And so fruits are an ingenious way of kind of that bribery incentive that we talked about with to disseminate your seeds. And so, like in the case of bribery we talked about, there might be some nectar involved that entice insects to come, and the pollen will get stuck on them and allow them to transport pollen elsewhere. In the case of fruits, there might be larger organisms, a lot of times animals and things like that. They'll have be enticed by these colorful, sweet-smelling fruits to come and eat them. And when they eat the fruit, they also eat the seeds. The seeds will pass through the digestive tract successfully without being harmed due to that seed coat, and be deposited in the animal species in another location. So this allows the seed to be moved to another location that's separate from the parent, because you don't want to have the parent and offspring all in the same area, because they will be competing for the same resources. So this will allow the offspring to be spread out to different locations, reducing the competition between parent and offspring, but also allows the new seed to have a nice nutrient-rich environment because it's now coated in manure. So it's really, really interesting that when we think of fruits, we're like, oh, this is so delicious. They're not doing it for us. They want us to transport their seeds to go elsewhere. So now that we've talked about bryophytes and we've talked about our vascular non-seeded plants and our vascular plants, both gymnosperms and angiosperms, and their various characteristics, let's take some time to talk about the how plants protect themselves. So plants, they can't get up and run away from predators, and they can't physically, fight back against a predator. So they've had to develop some innovative ways of protecting themselves and also communicating distress between different plants. So in order to protect themselves, plants can use two different methods. They can use anatomical structures, and some examples of these are thorns and spines, which if you've ever owned a cactus or accidentally ran into a burr bush or a rose bush, you're very familiar with these. But they can also use small hairs, so tiny hairs help with preventing predation from insects, or they can use shedding. And if you've been in Georgia for any period of time, you've probably seen a tree that looks like this, and it sheds its outer bark, and this is to help protect the sensitive internal tissues from predators, whether it be insects or fungi or bacteria. If that outer bark is shed, then those predators and those factors can no longer impact the internal tissues. Plants can also use chemical compounds. Oftentimes things that humans we might like for a different reason, hallucinogens. They're actually supposed to deter predators. We may use them for different purposes, but hallucinogens and toxins are designed to discourage predation. Also, plants can produce chemical compounds that are antibiotic, so to protect themselves from microbial threats. And then they can produce pitch or sap. If anybody's ever seen Jurassic Park, you're probably familiar with something that looks kind of like this, where there's a plant stuck in this ball of amber. This is a plant, this is not a plant, this is an insect that's stuck in tree sap. And over millions and millions of years, that tree sap can harden and become like a nice amber look. But essentially, that's one way that trees are trying to protect themselves. If an insect is eating your tissues and then you release sap down your trunk and the insect gets trapped in the sap, now you're protected from that predator. Plants can also use chemical compounds to communicate with one another. So if you've ever mowed the grass and you have that wonderful fresh grass smell, like fresh cut grass smell, that's actually a warning signal from blades of grass to other grass that are telling them to protect themselves. So when you start cutting the grass, the cut blades release these chemical compounds that are then received by the uncut grass and basically tells them you need to make changes so that you don't get eaten. We're being eaten over here, don't get eaten. Of course, the grass can't fight back against the lawnmower, but that's essentially what's happening. So that beautiful smell we love is actually a cry for help. And then we can also use the chemical compounds from plants medicinally and recreationally. So as I mentioned, hallucinogens, people often use those recreationally. They're supposed to be a deterrent from eating these plants, but for humans, it doesn't work that way so much. But also THC is also another compound that's actually supposed to deter animals from eating the marijuana plant. But not for humans. And then medicinally, many of the medicines that we use today actually originate from plants. And so the common pain relievers, a lot of the anti-cancer drugs, antivirals come from plants. So the chemical compounds from plants have some wide uses, not just for their own protection, but also for us. And then we have our interesting group of plants, our insectivores, some of my personal favorites. In these plants, they actually flip the script. So normally an insect is going to try to eat a plant. In this case, the plant eats the insect. And this is usually as a way of supplementing their diet. These types of plants generally grow in soils that are deficient in some sort of nutrient. Oftentimes it's nitrogen, and they need to eat a nitrogen-rich source in order to get their nitrogen to make their own proteins. And they do this by catching bugs. So my first personal favorites is the pitcher plant, which is just an example here. And the pitcher plant has like a U-shaped chamber at its base that it fills with a nice sugary like material, and that entices bugs to come in. And then they also have these hairs at the very top of their lip that point downwards. So the bee or whatever bug comes close and they're trying to like get to that nice sweet nectar in the middle. And then those hairs, they're so slippery and they point down that the bug falls into the nectar and gets digested. So some of these plants actually, once the insect is in there, will release digestive tissues, kind of like our stomach does, and will dissolve that bug and eat it. So these to me are just incredibly amazing. And then also plants are able to engage in some mutualistic relationships with other animals and microorganisms to ward off enemies. So we talked about the mutualistic relationship between pollinators when there's like nectar and bribery involved. And also in the case of like fruits, the plant benefits because it's able to spread its pollen or seeds, and then the animal benefits because it gets nutrients from the plant. But then also there can be interactions between plants and other organisms that help to protect themselves. So some plants will have a relationship with like various ants or other insects, so that let's say a predator comes along and wants to eat that plant, the organism that they're interacting with mutually will help to protect them. So let's say if a plant has an interaction with ants and it benefits the ants and it benefits the plant to be together, and then a deer tries to come up and eat that plant, the ants will attack that deer and protect the plant. So there's some interesting relationships that plants can undergo even though they're not even able to get up and move. They've been very, very successful in finding ways around immobility. Alrighty, so we've reached the end of our first lecture on plants, plant diversity. Go ahead and read chapter 14, sections 14.1 through 6, and then 14.8 through 14.12. The last couple portions of this chapter we'll come back to later, so 14.13 and on, when we talk about fungi later on in a couple of weeks. So really it's just the first kind of half or a little bit more than half of chapter 14. And then also the learning curve assignment that's associated with chapter 14. And then I've included a couple of videos here. Some of them may seem a little bit redundant, but I tried to give some variety on the life cycles of plants. So the first one is life cycle of mosses, and then I have the a double fertilization video, life cycles of gymnosperms in here. The alternation of generation video here, I put watch until minute 3 minutes and 51 seconds in. It gets a little odd after that, but the information that he provides all the way up to, from the beginning to 3 minutes and 51 seconds is really, really interesting and useful. And then I had included a video here that's just about plants being deceitful, like we talked about trickery, and some cool ways that plants have found to spread their seeds and to proliferate. So excellent. I hope this is a good, nice start to plants for you guys, and let's keep it going. Excellent. Have a good one.